Today I'm breaking down ZEN by Jennie, and the production on this track is insane. Because on the surface, it sounds minimal, but the more you listen, the more you hear underneath. It's aggressive but sleek, and that's exactly what makes this track so addictive. So in this breakdown, I'm opening up my version of the project and pulling apart exactly how this track creates that clean, high-end energy. From the drums and bass to synth textures and movement. And by the end, you'll know exactly how to bring this same feel into your own productions. So let's dive in, but first, here's the example. Okay, so let's break this one down. We're going to start with the drums. Here they are in solo. So let's take it right from the top, starting with the kick. And this is usually the first thing I'm thinking about when building a mix. So there are a few layers going on. We've got the very basic sub kick, and then a layer underneath that, which is basically just a roomy stomp. And notice that I've faded in the transient of this stomp, so it doesn't clash with the transient of the main sub kick, which is really where we want to get that impact from. So together they sound like this. And one thing that's really cool about this track is their use of percussion. And if we have a look at the kicks, it's not just that sub kick and stomp, we've also got some layered toms here. And so I've got this library called Apocalypse Percussion, and it's just really great for layering things and adding momentum, giving your tracks a sort of cinematic vibe. So this is it in isolation. And notice I've taken off some of the attacks, so again, they can sit underneath that sub kick. Whenever I'm layering percussion like this, I'm always thinking about one core element, and anything I'm layering around it is really more complementary and not competing with that main element. So I'd consider those three elements, the sub kick, toms, and stomp, as the low end body of my drum section. So this is what they sound like all together. One element that I love to include, which can really just enhance a section like this, are reverse kicks. And have a listen to what it adds to this section. It really gives it some drive and that kind of forward momentum. So if we move on to the snare, which is easily my favorite element in this track, this is the snare in isolation. And to really get that unique blend of sort of air and the bottom end, we've got a few layers going on here. So the foundational layer is this future bass snare that sounds like this. In isolation, it really doesn't carry it well. So the very first thing I did was add a gated reverb, and for that I've used H-Reverb by Waves. This is a really great plugin, has a really nice sound to it, and I've of course hooked it up to my gate in Ableton, so as you can see the sidechain is selected, and I've selected future snare, which is the snare we're looking at, and then adjusted the gate accordingly. And so you can see how the gate's reacting in the plugin. This is what it looks like. And notice the gate's just clamping down for the duration of that snare. So this is what it sounds like with and without the gate. So this is actually a really cool technique that, if used correctly, can have a massive impact on the way your snare sits in the mix. So definitely recommend playing around with that. It won't work for absolutely everything, but in the case where your snare just needs that extra bit of body and space, this is a great technique. So moving on, we've got a couple of other layers that are really helping the snare along. The next one is more of a trappy kind of snare, and this is from my sample pack. And underneath that, we've got a really nice machine clap, and this just gives it some brightness and air on the top end. So here are those three layers together. And they hit pretty hard, but they're still missing that little bit of body that we heard earlier. And so the final layer for the snare here is actually a kick. And it's the same kick that I used for my main sub kick, and it sounds like this. And layered with the snares, it sounds like this. And here's the before and after with and without that kick layered on top. So you can really hear the impact that that extra kick layer gives it. And so one thing to note when you're applying this to your own productions, every layer here is strategic. We're starting with a bass sound, for example, the future snare or the main sub kick, and everything we're putting on top is complementary, and it'll differ in either texture or pitch. So to recap, for when you're layering, keep one foundational sound, and the rest should be ornamental for character. So if we move on to the two percussion layers that we have, this is what it sounds like. So let's first start with the hats. Here they are in isolation. So rhythmically, these hats are really cool, and it was just really interesting sort of listening along and trying to follow every change that they're making. So the first thing to note is that the hat sample is not overly long, so we want to keep that fairly short in the sampler. I've taken off a fair bit of top end because sometimes that can really be distracting, especially with hi-hats. I've crushed them a little bit with soft clipping because sometimes I find that rounding out those peaks just helps it sort of sit in the mix a little bit better and blend in a little more with the other percussions. I've used a little bit of phase and just in parallel, so not a whole heap. And for some reason, there's 2 instances of Soothe doing the exact same thing, and I have no idea why. But initially, all I was trying to achieve here was just using a hi-hat preset and then adjusting from there, trying to get some of that harshness out of around 4K. And as you can see here, closer to 8K as well. So we're going to take off that second instance of Soothe. And it definitely sounds a little more crisp now, as it was supposed to. So with the percussion loop, I'm going to play it for you dry with no plugins at all, and this is what it sounds like. So one by one, I'm adding some EQ, then RC20. And notice we're really taking advantage of the noise that comes with that distortion, really just for the character and just filling out the sound a little bit more. It pushes back the original signal, so it doesn't sound great in isolation, but in the context of the mix, that noise just really helps it sit a little better and sort of fills out the drums that little bit more. So don't underestimate the power of, a bit of background noise or hiss in plugins like this. Of course, if it's intentional, you'll definitely benefit doing that. So then moving to Soothe, really just controlling around 1.5 to 4K or so. And then of course some EQ just to get rid of that sort of low-end rumble that comes with using something like RC20. So then the last element I want to show you inside the drums is this clap, and it sounds like this. So it's very washed out, very dense, and notice that we've got a small reverse leading up to it. I think that for elements like this, big splashes out of nowhere, it's always nice to try and ease it in rather than sort of having it appear out of nowhere. So then our drums all together sound like this. So moving on to the basses, this is them in isolation. So we'll take this layer by layer. The first one is the 808, and it sounds like this. Now this is a little bit different to what I normally do, which is find an 808 and then just sort of layer it with synths and things. What I've done here is actually use a preset in Sublab XL. This is a really cool VST. I don't use it all the time, but for something like this, it just was really fitting. So the preset alone, I don't think I messed around with much, but the reason I chose it is because it has that solid low end, but also that kind of buzziness on top. And it's kind of separated those elements really nicely in advance, and the bass just works as is. The only processing I really chose to do on it was, of course, just with the EQ. So we've got some dynamic EQ here just so it interacts with the kick nicely, and you can see that in action here. We've then got a little bit of saturation just in parallel, something I really like to do to my sub basses in general because it just sort of makes them a little bit more present on smaller devices particularly. So without that saturation, it sounds like this. And then with. Just adds a touch more depth to that sound. And then I followed that up with just a little bit of multiband, really just to lift the hairs on the upper mids, and finishing it off with just a touch of limiting. So the next layer is really what gives these basses its identity. So this is kind of the moving layer that sits underneath. It's not carrying much weight in the low end, but it's really just designed to sit in that upper mid range and sort of float around the stereo field a little bit. And the way we're really achieving that is through a phaser. So this is up to about halfway, which is pretty significant for something like this. I've even widened it with a little bit of stereo imaging, which in this case might be a little bit overkill, but it kind of worked for what I was doing. And so together with the initial bass, it sounds like this. And then without. Another thing to note is that I've removed the fundamental from this sound within Serum. And if you haven't come across this technique yet, basically hit the pencil icon, go to process, and then remove fundamental. And this will remove that fundamental information from those bass notes and just allow it to sit with a sub that carries a lot more of that low end. The next layer I have just kind of fills out the low mids a little bit more. It's more of a utility layer rather than something for design like the previous layer. So it sounds like this. And have a listen to the difference with and without when it's playing with the other two layers. And then with. So as you can hear, it really fills out those basses, and it's not an obvious element, but it plays its role really well. So moving on to the synths and vocal chops, we're going to start with the main synth, and it sounds like this. So to break this down, the very first thing I did was just make the melody on a raw piano line, and it sounds like this. And to achieve the sound we heard previously, I chopped up each note and bounced it to audio, and then reversed each note individually. And so instead of getting a straight note like this, you'll get something like this. And then to give it that extra bit of character, I doubled it and put it the octave up. As far as processing, I used RC20 once again, just on the Vinyl 1 preset, and usually what I'll do is pick a preset and work backwards from there, and that just gave it that really nice kind of tape saturation and bit of wobble that can really just do so much for an otherwise bland sound, even in small amounts. So moving on to more of these kind of vocal pads, I kind of treat these as a bit of a synth, but with a vocal texture. So this is what they sound like in isolation. And they really do a great job of filling out the space. So because I'm using individual notes, and this is a really cool arrangement trick just for any sort of chords, and it's what I call split chords. So basically, instead of having a pad playing every single note of the chord, you can split that into 4 or 5 tracks and have each track playing a different note from the chord. And you can do this with different textures. I've chosen to do this with sort of different octaves from the actual vocal, so it's more choir-like. But you could do this by mixing more of a sawtooth pad, a choir pad, and something even more shimmery, and it'll just give you a really nice width and depth for a track like this. So definitely recommend having a play around with that. As you can hear, we've got one on the far right. That's a little bit lower, and then this one. And then a pedal tone sitting across the top on the other side. Another technique worth noting is the use of LFO tool on the actual vocal pad bus. The goal of this is to give it just a little bit of jitter, a little bit of movement, because without it, it can sound just a little bit dry, a little bit stale. So zeroing in on what this is actually doing, we've got the stutter set up, but with the depth very, very low, and we're just automating that in gradually throughout the chord. So check out the depth knob as we go. It ascends gradually just for the duration of each chord. The last vocal chop we have is just before the chorus hits, and on the record this is actually really cool because the vowel actually changes as it evolves. So I haven't done that here, I've just used exhale with a very raw vocal pad, but this is what it sounds like in isolation. So it sounds really cool, and we're using automation once again on LFO tool, and you'll notice again the depth knob is just gradually increasing. So one cool thing that happens throughout this chorus is this kind of growl. And again, this isn't something that I would do naturally in a track, but a really cool thing you can do is add these growls just as an audio sample, and they sound like this. I've then doubled it, nudged it, and created the Haas effect, so you can hear it on both sides. And this is really cool because it just adds this burst of a totally different texture, and it's sort of a nice piece of ear candy that you can include in your tracks if it's appropriate. It definitely adds to that kind of industrial electronic feel. So if we go to the next section, we've got a couple more synths left, and they sound like this. So this is a really nice texture switch between the pluck bass and the synth pad. So it sounds like this in isolation. And I basically made this very raw and basic preset just from an initialized patch inside Serum. We've then layered it with a respace. So that respace underneath just does so much to add that kind of body to an otherwise kind of thin pad like this. So as for the pluck bass, it's a fairly basic sort of arpeggiated bass sound. And something I found really interesting they were doing on the record is layering it with a tambourine, and it just gives it this kind of gnarly top end that I think is really cool. And in that section, here's everything together. And now here's what we looked at in its entirety. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out Pop Producer OS below, or click the link below to book a free call with me to learn about our coaching program and see if we're the right fit. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to check out this one over here. I think you'll really enjoy it.